The Edmonton Oilers winning streak came to an end Saturday afternoon in frustrating fashion to the Toronto Maple Leafs on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. So on today's show, going to walk through the game against the Leafs, some big picture ideas more so than the game itself, because again, it is only one game. We'll talk about the Oilers' slow starts, which again, recurring theme this season, something that is becoming a bit of a pattern and it is difficult to overcome. In our second segment, we're going to tackle why games like that against the Leafs and teams of the Leafs caliber in particular are illuminating and something you can build off of even in losses. And then we'll tie a bow on this episode, setting up the run here up until the Four Nations face-off, which starts next week. So, first of all, if you are listening or watching and my voice sounds a little raspy, yes, I've had a little bit of a tickle in my throat over the last few days. Not dying, nothing particularly stressful, but it is definitely noticeable if you're used to listening to my voice and you know what it sounds like. So if my voice is not as good as it usually sounds, apologies. But in terms of the game itself, number one, I know, as an Oiler fan, you're probably tired of people. You're tired of people making fun of the team. Anytime a player says anything, the Oilers are held to a very weird standard where Connor McDavid is both very boring, but he also complains a lot. And Leon Draisaitl is a really good player, but he complains a lot. So setting the tone for the game on Saturday afternoon where, jokingly Leon says, anything for the Leafs about a 5:00 Mountain Time puck drop for what, is supposed to be a Hockey Night in Canada game. But because you want to get the Leafs television market in on the window for 7:00, that's why the puck drops at 5:00 local. And it's a little annoying. We talk about routines, how hockey players are creatures of habit, how they don't like to change things. And to play at 5:00 when you're used to a 7 or 7:30 start time, it's not the end of the world, but I do get tired of the inconsistencies. And look, I'll make a sweeping proclamation. Everyone's team does things that annoys fans of other teams. Trying to moralize and do the my team is better than your team because of X, Y, and Z thing for things that aren't wins and losses and tangible and trackable. We're getting into moralizing. And, the thing about morals and ethics and non-tangible traits, everyone's opinions are different and what people care about are different. So arguing about, it's not fair if there are people who are dismissively criticizing the Oilers for not liking a 5:00 start time when they're the home team, whatever. The game itself, the Oilers can't keep doing this, man. Fundamentally, it is just not a good habit to get in. And the Oilers are a good hockey team. Their record, even when the other team scores first, is not bad. It's passable. It's good enough that they can make up for the games where they don't score first. But they are going down a challenging path is the way I'll describe it, because so much of what we understand about score impacts in hockey, you have such an environmental advantage when you can play a game with the lead. And there's a strong correlation there between scoring first and having a better record. Now, it is not the most important thing. I'm going to read some goal differentials in the first period, and there are some pretty bad teams who have passable first period goal differentials, and then there are some teams who are pretty good, who have good goal differentials, and then there are some teams who are good who don't and get better as the game goes along. And I think that presents an interesting thought experiment if you're a hockey fan or an observer, someone like me who does content, where you are trying to understand as much of the game as you possibly can. And of course, because hockey is vibrant, because it's a living entity that is evolving and changing and based on players, you're not ever going to be able to understand everything, but you can try. You can try to learn more and test theories and gain a more deep and meaningful understanding. When you go and look, the Oilers this year in first period have been outscored by opponents 54-45. That's a pretty rough goal split. -9, -9 on the season. That's the 26th best goal differential. That's bottom 6 in the league in terms of first period goal differential. And of course, we're just talking about the first period. And as anybody who's ever read The Turtle and the Hare, the fable, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And the Oilers, of course, based on their record, they can tell you their record is evidence that scoring first is not the most important thing in the world. It helps, the Oilers have a significantly better record in games where they score first. When they score first, the Oilers are 18-4-4. In games where the opponent scores first, they're 14-12. Now, 14-12 is not good, but it's passable. It's important. And 18-4-4 is such a drastic split that it goes to show you there is an importance there. Some of the best teams in the regular season this year, the Golden Knights have a +4 goal differential. The Winnipeg Jets have a +20. The Washington Capitals have a +17. But then you have teams like the Utah Hockey Club, who are well underwater in terms of their overall record. They have a +14 goal differential. The Tampa Bay Lightning, who are kind of fighting for their playoff lives, are +17. And then you go to the other end of the spectrum and you look at the negative goal differentials. The Carolina Hurricanes, they're only +2 on the year. The Dallas Stars, +12. That's pretty good. But Florida Panthers are only +7. The Kings are +7. The Wild are +5. Teams like the Devils are -4. The Islanders are -5. And then of course, teams like the Sharks, -26. That is the worst goal differential, first period goal differential in the entire league. There's a lot to unpack here, because approaching this from a thought perspective and just how I would explain this, I think there's a case to be made that a quality team, as the game goes along, they get to their game and they start to get into what I would say is repeatable and habitual. And that makes you more effective. You get into a pattern, you get to start making it simpler, where you can just do the same thing over and over and over again. And that starts to wear down the other team. And when you play with the lead, you are naturally going to be less risk. You're going to be more risk averse. You're going to take fewer chances. And I think at least there's an argument to be made that you can have good results even if you don't score first, because as the game goes along, if a team has a lead for a longer stretch of the game, they get into bad habits. And you might say, well, Nick, they're professional athletes, but they are people. If you start getting lulled to sleep, which is kind of what happened to the Oilers the other night, where they got out to a lead and they let the other team hang around, and ultimately it did them in. It's frustrating. You don't want to make it the end of the world. Like I said the other night when they lost to Detroit in the shootout, they are at a point where not every game is the end of the world when they lose, but this is a pattern. And yeah, they got out to the lead against Detroit, but they let it slip away. On Saturday, they let Toronto get out to a big lead, and they made a valiant effort at coming back. But your margin for error when you need to score 4 straight goals is really, really daunting. We are going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we're going to dive into a little bit more about why this game in particular might be a bit more illuminating than some of the Oilers' recent games. A whole lot more, so be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, the Eagles, the Chiefs, again. And at FanDuel, endless possibilities, and there is no better place to make every play more exciting. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, Super Bowl MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, icing on the cake. The line has not moved. The Kansas City Chiefs are still 1.5-point favorites to go for the NFL's first three-peat in the Super Bowl era. So if you want to get in on the action, download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. It's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, an official partner of Super Bowl 59. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. And I should clarify, in the cold open, I said the Oilers winning streak ended. I should have said regulation winning streak ended. Want to make sure I get that right. It is important to be correct. And when you are incorrect, it is important to acknowledge it and correct it, because that's being accountable. And it's an important part of doing this job. Is I need to have credibility with you guys. You guys need to know I know what I'm talking about, and you need to know that if I make a mistake, which, I'm human, sometimes you misspeak or you misread something and you want to be factual, so it's important. But the Leafs are a very talented team. I think there are a lot of arguments that casual hockey fans would make that the Oilers and the Leafs are in very similar boats in terms of organizational strengths, lineup, and the way the teams have prioritized their spending, what they seem to value. And it's really straightforward. You look at where the money is on these teams, and the Leafs have continuously opted to spend money on their stars. The Nylander, Tavares, Marner, Matthews quad has had really good regular seasons. Matthews has won some individual awards. Marner has been a vote getter for some of the more serious awards. Nylander has really come on in the last year or two as a top, I would say, 20-25 player in the sport. And they haven't ever really spent a lot of money on defense. They haven't ever really spent a ton of money on goaltending. And the Oilers are kind of in a similar boat. Their money is not as tied up in as few players, but that is going to change. And there are some people, and I think it's a fair critique, I think it's fair to say, worried that the Oilers might end up with a very skewed roster in the same way the Leafs have, where once you see what Draisaitl's number is, which we have, and you see what Bouchard's next contract is and what McDavid's next contract is, and you add all those up, you're going to be pretty close to what Tavares, Nylander, Marner, Matthews were, 2 or 3 years ago in terms of cap hit. And the cap's going to keep going up. And we're going to do more content and center some conversations around how the Oilers cap planning can change in anticipation of these rises. But you look at the Leafs and their problems, their depth issues, both up front and on the back end. And it's tied to a lack of flexibility. And it's not for a lack of guys wanting to play for the Leafs. Toronto is a marquee market, but at the same time, this is a team that's really struggled to find that third line center that has had a rotation of wingers throughout the Marner, Nylander, Matthews, Tavares era, where guys like Kapanen and Michael Bunting and Zach Hyman, where they have rotated through pretty good players over the years. And because of the financial commitments, they've had to cut bait on good players. Trading Rasmus Sandin at the deadline 2 years ago to the Capitals, that's unfortunate, because Rasmus Sandin is a pretty good NHL defenseman. I would venture to say he would probably be the Leafs' third or fourth best defenseman right now. And the Leafs on their back end have done the revolving door. They spent a lot of money on Chris Tanev this past offseason, who has done an amicable job playing with as a Leaf this year. But Tanev, Jake McCabe, Morgan Riley, OEL, and then Simon Benoit and Connor Timmins, that's a pretty weak six defenseman group. And I know Yanni Hakanpää's hurt. I know OEL is hurt. But you look at where the money is and the guys they've spent on, whether it's someone like a Ryan Reeves or a Kelly Yarncroc, who, look, I think Yarncroc is pretty good. Steven Lorentz is fine, but like, that's what happens when you have to spend your money on depth guys, you know? When you have only so much money to throw around and you want to spend a good chunk of it on one of these guys, you know, like Max Domi, who was okay for them last year, but hasn't really fit well this season. It's a conundrum. And it's why, if I'm the Oilers, and I am going to get to the game from Oilers-Leafs comparison perspective in a second, but the Oilers need to tread lightly here. And they don't have a ton of long-term financial commitments. They're really only tied up in a lot of these guys for the next 2 or 3 years, and then they can start to adjust as the cap increases. But putting together a Stanley Cup caliber roster is really difficult. And what we try and take away from every given year, the previous year, who wins, what can you learn from their roster, how it's put together, it's one of the great challenges, and it's something I genuinely like. It is one of the real challenges that makes this rewarding because there's not a definitive answer. You know, you look at the Panthers last year, there's nothing that jumps out to you as far as why aren't other teams doing this? Could you say reclamation project? Sure. You know, they bet on Sam Reinhart. They bet on Brandon Montour. You could say they bet on Sam Bennett. They bet on Nico Mikkola, Oliver Ekman-Larsson. They did bet on some of their depth guys as being just needing a change of scenery or a different role and got great value. You know, Gus Forsling, probably their best defenseman, was a waiver claim, somebody they saw a vision for and were able to translate. But real quick, as far as the game, when you play a team like the Leafs and you let them make a mistake, and you make a mistake, you're inviting trouble. You know, you go back and watch the 3 Leafs goals while the game is still viable. You know, it's not 3-0. The first Leafs goal is failed zone exit 2 times. The Oilers have 2 chances to exit the zone. The Leafs keep it in, goal. 2 power play goals against. The mistakes are at the net front. Their jam plays, their rebounds are not controlled well enough. The defensemen don't clear the crease, and it puts the team in a 3-0 hole. And I'm going to dive deeper into this. I'm going to look and see if there's a correlation, whether it's save percentage or scoring chances. You know, if the Oilers are giving up more dangerous chances at the start of games because they're getting off to slow starts, that is something that's correctable. That's something that you can address from a coaching or strategic standpoint. But if this is just, you know, the variance of a long season and they're in a rut for like 2 or 3 weeks where they just can't get off to good starts, that's something that'll bear out in the numbers as well. So that's something I plan on looking into over the course of this week. We're going to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we're going to tie a bow on this by setting the table for this stretch of games coming up to the Four Nations face-off and then the run from Four Nations up to the trade deadline. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got you covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we're setting the tone for the week. Next week, during the run-up to Four Nations, when the Oilers don't play, because the Oilers play this week, they play tomorrow, Wednesday, and then on Friday, and then they're off until the 22nd. So next week, the content is going to be more big picture. We're going to do report cards. We'll do the forward group, the defensive group, the goaltending. We'll do power rankings for the league at wide. I'm going to try and get a guest or two and record ahead of time. I'll be doing some Four Nation stuff as well. McDavid, obviously, one of the faces, if not the face of Team Canada. So it's important I do that. We'll be away from next like Wednesday through Monday. So the content is going to be a little more vague and bigger picture because I won't be able to do full episodes while I'm away because I don't have editing software on my iPad where I can edit video. I don't really want to edit 30-minute episodes in CapCut that I record on my phone. Like, it's doable, but it won't be a good experience for you guys. So I will be sure to get that content squared away and taken care of nice and ahead of time. But did want to let you guys know I'll be dropping that reminder throughout this week's this week's slate of shows. But final segment. The Oilers have 3 games until the Four Nations face-off break. They have to play St. Louis tomorrow, the Blackhawks the day after, the Avs on Friday, and then they're off for 3 weeks. As we sit here right now, the Oilers are still in first place in the Pacific Division, I believe, because Vegas lost against the Rangers tonight. So in theory, the Oilers should still be in first place. Going to fact check that. Yes, they are in first place by virtue of having a game in hand. So they have a slightly better points percentage. But with so little time left, 3 games until Four Nations, it's 9 games until the trade deadline, which is March 5th. And then there are 30 games remaining in the regular season. You break those 30 games into 10-game pockets, and you tell yourself you probably need to win something in the ballpark of 23 out of 30 down the backstretch if you want to win the division. And 23 out of 30 is ambitious. The Oilers are going to make the playoffs, barring disaster, as long as they maintain something resembling a pulse. The teams behind them, other than Vegas, aren't really making headway. Like the Kings are having an okay season, but I don't see that as a team that's capable of going on a real heater. Colorado is in the first wild card spot right now. Calgary in the second. I suppose Vancouver is capable of rattling off enough games to get back in the mix as far as a wild card. But right now, they're 11 points back of the Oilers with the same amount of games played. And there would need to be a real jump in performance for Vancouver to get back even in the divisional race, let alone the wild card race. But this is where you really start to separate. It's taken the Oilers a real long time this season to get where they needed to be as far as the division. After that first month, I figured they were going to be in the same boat as last year, where Vegas was going to run away with the division the same way Vancouver did last year. The Oilers would get an LA or Vancouver first round matchup this year, and we'd go from there. But the Oilers have really played tremendous hockey since American Thanksgiving. They have been the best team in the NHL points percentage wise during that stretch. And it's a real testament to this group. And I do think this group is a little more flawed than last year's. I think it lacks foot speed. I think the defensive group lacks experience. And the power play is not as efficient. And I just feel like there's another gear to get to, which is both good and bad. Because if you want to look at this glass half full, the fact that the Oilers are in first place in the Pacific Division, and it feels like their power play and a few of their contributors like Zach Hyman, Nugent-Hopkins, Jeff Skinner, Victor Arvidsson, that those guys have a little bit more to give, that should be a good thing. Because if those guys just get back to their career averages, then the Oilers can be better than they are without really changing a whole lot. The counterpoint to that is, and the drawback of that is, if those guys are either just having a down year, which is possible, or they're just regressing and they are becoming their new versions of themselves as they get older or as their roles change, that's something the Oilers need to be able to account for. And I think taking a stab on guys like Kapanen, on John Klingberg, I think that makes sense from the perspective of, we know we have roster deficiencies. We know we don't have a ton of money. We don't have a lot of assets to burn. If all we need to do is spend cap space, and in some cases be able to push cap space to next season, like in Klingberg's case, okay, you can sell me on these as practical, pragmatic solutions to these issues. Now, I still think the Oilers have a strong case that they need to go out there and make something happen. We are a month and 3 days away from the NHL trade deadline. We know the Vegas Golden Knights will be making something happen. We can anticipate that the Vancouver Canucks, who traded for Marcus Pettersson, who traded for JT Miller, probably have another move to make. Dallas, Minnesota, Winnipeg, those teams all likely have moves to make. I imagine the Colorado Avalanche also have another move to make on top of the Mikko Rantanen trade. That does not necessarily mean you need to get into a bidding war or an arms race with your contemporaries to try and improve your roster. But it is something to keep in mind that you can't bank on Evander Kane. You can't bank on John Klingberg. And it's going to be a real test of Stan Bowman's risk tolerance. And as a general manager, your tolerance for risk is really what ultimately defines you, because there are some GMs who are too reticent to ever fully commit to a given year. You know, they don't want to put too many eggs in one basket, and they would rather play the long game, kind of what we've seen in Carolina over the years, up until the last 2 years, where, you know, last year Jake Gensel, this year Mikko Rantanen. You know, you could say the Rangers to some degree up until this year, same boat. You know, last year, Jack Roslovic, Alex Wennberg. Year before that, one hit Patrick Kane and Tarasenko. Year before that, Frank Vetrano and Andrew Kopp. Whereas the Oilers, it's been a bit more strategic. You know, last year, Sam Carrick, Adam Henrique, very precise, specific roles in mind, not a big fish. A couple years ago, though, you needed another real defenseman to complement Evan Bouchard. You went and got Ekholm, and you've entirely fundamentally changed the outlook of your organization. You know, of all of the moves and for all of the criticism I have leveled against Ken Holland in retrospect for the Oilers' lack of organizational depth, their lack of prospect graduates from the AHL. Matthias Ekholm fundamentally altered the outlook of this team because it gave them an elite first pair. And if you have that, you can get by with passable second and third pairs. And this year, I would say the Oilers' second pair is between passable and good. I think it's probably above average. I don't know if I would venture to say it's good. I'll definitely get to that when we do report cards next week. But I do think that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So if you could be so kind, would really appreciate if you could subscribe to the show on a podcast platform. If you're on Apple or Spotify and you can take an extra second, please leave the show a 5-star review. The more reviews we get, the easier it is for people to find the show. The easier it is to grow, the more stuff we have the capacity to do here at Locked On Oilers. Same deal over on YouTube. We're on the road to 2,000, which is the goal before the playoffs start in April. It's attainable. We only need a couple hundred more every day out there grinding in the content trenches. Get on board, get on for the stretch run, trade deadline, home stretch, playoffs. There's so much stuff to talk about, and I can't wait to do it. I hope you'll get on board. I will talk to you guys tomorrow ahead of the game against, I want to say it's St. Louis if I'm reading the schedule correctly. Yes, I will talk to you guys tomorrow ahead of the game against St. Louis. See you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.